Hegel's claim that self-consciousness requires two self-consciousnesses is something I don't think anyone should find convincing at the face of it, for I myself do not find it convincing without elaboration. Part of the issue that I think highly confuses the understanding of the section is that Hegel brings up the I am I of the not yet self-conscious consciousness. Bringing this in ends up being confusing, for in the common understanding, the I am I is considered a basic form of self-consciousness. But what does the I am I say that makes us think this? Am I not self-conscious when I reflect on myself and claim, I am I? It seems utterly ludicrous to say one is not self-conscious in such a situation. So what gives? Well, what does I am I say in its mere claim? This claim by consciousness is merely the law of tautological self-identity, which merely separates the I from all else as other to it. It is not yet a self-reflecting claim or awareness. The I here is also not yet a universal kind differentiated between one particular instance and another. It is a pure, immediate, contentless individuality. This is to say, this claim is purely one without difference, in that I am I does not imply I am not you or someone else. That is to say, the I am I is not yet a reflection of the self as self. In that consciousness does not recognize another consciousness. What point, what meaning is there to the claim I am I? I am I as opposed to what? Perhaps we may look toward mystical philosophy, or rather mystical practice itself, where supposedly the I am is simply the observer of experience, of thoughts, of feelings. It is simply the medium of consciousness itself. It is not a thing, and it is not a subject. It does not do, it simply is. And it is no particular one and no particular thing. Certainly, however, this is not what we mean by the self or self-consciousness in our everyday conversations. When we make this claim, it is very different to the claim of Hegel's self-consciousness on its own. In our claim, we implicitly carry universal notions of self and other. As language bearers and developed cultural beings, we have language, culture, and a divided consciousness. We carry an internal other within us from which we reflect, our conscience and our internalized imagination of how others view us. A consciousness with no such power of language, conceptual thought, cultural history, nor social existence has no concept of self, for all it has is its own experienced, pure, empty individuality. Indeed, I am I, as opposed to what? You? There is no you at such a point, for such a consciousness has no recognition of anything that is like itself. There is no community of I's, only the existence of I and I alone. All that I means and is at such a point is the power of negation of all before it. It is I as opposed to the world, but it is not I as opposed to myself in the identity and difference to myself, nor the identity and the difference to my own kind. Step back from society. Step back from self-consciousness. And what do we have? If the I is subject, and a subject is as it does, what kind of I do we have? What kind of self? Well, immediately below us is the self of animals, the self of a living organism in general. This self experiences itself as relentless desire. The I is nothing but pure desire, the consciousness which is at home with itself as desiring life, and its endless task to negate all by consumption and nullification. For this I, there are no other I's. There is only it and a world which opposes it, a world which resists its attempt to realize its desires, and therefore it either overcomes it in consumption, or, if it is not the immediate object of desire, it is destroyed on the path of life's desire. This I acts toward a world that faces it as other, but in the consumption of desire it attempts to prove to itself that nothing is truly other, that it is truth and essence alone, for there is nothing that withstands its negation. To this I, it and it alone is absolute. It is its world. To it otherness is but an appearance whose truth is the I. The issue with I am I is not just its poverty as a claim, for it is a meaningless tautology, but also an ontological one. The ontology of self-consciousness is not simply a tautological declaration of self-relation, nor is the experience of self-consciousness simply such a declaration. To be capable of self-consciousness is not the capacity to simply recognize myself as an individuality, but to recognize consciousness in general, that is, to recognize other consciousnesses and their likeness and difference to mine. What does I am I mean when I have no concept of other I's against which I differentiate? Nothing. The problem with mistaking the claim of I am I as a proof of self-consciousness lies in that for us it carries too many assumptions from our already deeply socially embedded self-awareness and the resulting internally self-reflective consciousness. To be genuinely self-conscious is to see my self-consciousness from the standpoint of another self-consciousness, while in the standpoint of my own self-consciousness. When we say we are very self-conscious about ourselves in any manner, Hegel means something deeply similar by his concept of self-consciousness. We do not simply mean that we recognize that we are ourselves. No, when we are self-conscious, we mean by this that we are aware of how others are aware of us, and that we are aware that they are capable of being self-aware just as we are. So to be clear, the meaning of self-consciousness here is not what we typically think. Yes, at a very rudimentary, basic level, self-consciousness is consciousness of consciousness. For example, when animals are aware of other animals in the forest, they are operating in self-consciousness, but they are not for themselves self-conscious. Let me repeat that. Consciousness which is capable of recognizing other consciousnesses, such as the everyday basic animals we encounter, operates in self-consciousness, for these creatures are conscious of consciousness, but they are not on the level of self-consciousness as self-consciousness. With the I am I, self-consciousness is easy to mistake as consciousness, which has consciousness as its object, that it is merely consciousness of consciousness. Thus, we would think that it would be conceived in terms of a doubled consciousness and not a doubled self-consciousness. Why must we conceive of it this way? The reason is quite simple. If a self-consciousness does not hold as its object self-consciousness, then it is not self-conscious of itself as self-consciousness. And if self-consciousness is not conscious of itself as self-consciousness, then clearly it is not really self-conscious, for it does not in fact hold itself as its own object. If a self-conscious being, for example, never encounters another self-conscious being, and only encounters conscious beings, it is never quite self-conscious, unless somehow it turns its consciousness upon itself to behold its own self-consciousness and therefore fully being self-conscious. Considering the rare but very interesting studies of so-called feral children, we must surmise that this is a very difficult task indeed, a task which is virtually impossible without social development. For Hegel, consciousness is a cognition. It is an awareness that is only outward directed, towards an other as object. This awareness is always pointed outward and never is reflected back inwards. A self-consciousness can exist as a mere consciousness insofar as it does not have another self-consciousness to cause the cognitive awareness to reflect back inwards. Alone, two self-consciousnesses are mere consciousness. But when they encounter each other, they have the capacity to recognize each other as self-consciousnesses. Like a light beam projected outwards from an infinitely deep and dark abyssal mirror, consciousness's awareness reaches outward and grasps the other in its gaze. When two encounter, however, each is primed to detect and recognize the gaze, the emitted light beam of the other impinging on it. Immediately, self-consciousness recognizes consciousness at one and the same moment, as one, as its object of awareness. Two, that it, the first self-consciousness, is itself the object of the other's awareness. And three, as being recognized as consciousness by the other. The formula of self-consciousness is thus this: I am aware of you, being aware of me, being aware of you. Through you, I have been forced into becoming aware of myself as consciousness, which is the object of consciousness. That is, self-awareness, self-consciousness, has been achieved for both through a mediation of each other. In other words, self-consciousness is a reflective cognition, an awareness between two genuine others in which the other is recognized as other, yet as of the same kind. Self-consciousness is the closed circuit of recognition between two. When it is not yet already given, this is how it happens. We have consciousness, and consciousness is its object. The first consciousness goes out, grasps the other as consciousness. It knows what consciousness is, and therefore knows that it is the object of the other. And in being the object of the other, it has now been reflected back onto itself. I look outward, and I see you, and I know that you are looking at me, and therefore I have returned to myself and contemplate myself. That is the nature and truth of self-consciousness. This has been Antonio Wolf. Thank you for listening.